The silver tray slipped from her hands and struck the marble floor, and the sound of it tore through the quietest dinner in Chicago. Adeline Whitmore pressed a hand to her mouth, backed away from the table, her face gone white as paper. 22 of the most powerful people in the city stopped chewing. No one dared breathe. At the head of the table, Cassian Rinaldi set down his knife, slowly, and watched his wife disappear into the hallway, the woman he had married with a 3-year contract. In a marriage both of them knew could never produce a child, because years ago 6 doctors had signed their names to a single page, declaring that he could never father one. He looked at the sauce spreading across the floor like an open wound, and in the mind of the man whose name this city could only say in a lowered voice, a dark, heavy suspicion took root as he watched his pale, trembling wife vanish into the shadows of the hallway. 3 seats down, a hand wearing a black stone ring set a wineglass on the table. No one noticed that the hand was trembling. If you want to know the truth behind that night, leave a like, share this story, tell us what you think in the comments, and subscribe to our channel to walk this road with us. 3 months before the night that silver tray crashed onto the marble floor, hail tapped against the windows on the 41st floor of the Rinaldi Meridian building, one pellet at a time, steady and cold, as though someone out there were counting down toward something. Adeline Whitmore sat with her back straight in the chair across the table, both hands resting on her lap, and the sleeve of her medical blouse still carried a faint stain of antiseptic that hadn't had time to fade. She had come straight here from the hospital after 12 continuous hours on duty, without changing her clothes, her tired hair simply tied back with a plain elastic band. The scent of disinfectant had followed her into this room, slipping quietly among all the expensive things, and she was the only person there carrying a smell that belonged to the world of the living and the dying. On the long table in front of her sat 3 neatly arranged stacks of paper. The first was the file on her father's debt, left behind by the man who had died on an overpass during a rainy night 4 years earlier, leaving his daughter with $340,000, and a silence no one had ever been able to explain. The second was the bill from Elm Grove Nursing Home, where her mother lived, $9,000 every month, and the month before, Adeline had been forced to sell her old car just to make the payment in full. The third stack was the thinnest of all, only a few pages, with a bold title printed in the center, a marriage contract lasting 3 years. Ezra Kane stood on the right side of the table, reading each clause in the even voice of a man accustomed to reading documents capable of changing a person's entire life without needing to place emphasis on a single word. 3 years, separate rooms, public appearances whenever the family required them. There was no clause concerning affection, and none concerning children, because both sides understood that such a thing was impossible. In return, every dollar of her father's debt would be erased, and every medical expense for her mother would be paid for the rest of her life, without limit and without condition. Adeline didn't look at the papers. She looked at the man seated at the head of the table. Cassian Rinaldi didn't ask whether she agreed. He said only one sentence, short and almost gentle, telling her that the pen was at the right corner of the table. Then he fell silent. Ezra shifted half a step. Everyone in this building knew what that silence meant. Cassian Rinaldi never gave an order twice. He spoke once, then silently counted 3 beats in his head, and if the other person hadn't moved by the end of the third, there would be no 4th beat. People said there had been men who lost control of an entire port route simply because they hesitated half a second too long on the 3rd beat. Ezra had stood beside him for years, and he had never seen anyone let Cassian finish counting. 1st beat. Adeline didn't move. 2nd beat. The hail kept tapping against the glass, steady and merciless. She remained perfectly still, her hands on her lap, her eyes fixed on his. The 3rd beat passed, and she was still sitting there. Something very small changed in the room. Ezra felt it before he understood it. Cassian wasn't angry. He tilted his head slightly, the way a man might when he had just encountered something he hadn't accounted for in a plan that had already considered every possible outcome. Adeline reached for the pen, but before she lowered it to the page, she spoke, and her voice didn't tremble. "You can buy my apartment. You can buy the place where my mother sleeps. You can buy this signature, but there's one thing you'll never be able to buy. And I want you to hear that clearly from this moment forward. That's my word. My job is telling families what has happened to the people they love. I don't sell that." Cassian didn't answer. He only looked at her. "Longer than necessary," she signed. Her handwriting was small, neat, and firm, the handwriting of someone accustomed to recording things that weren't allowed to be wrong. Then she set the pen down and asked one final question. "What happens if one of us changes our mind?" Ezra looked up. No one had ever asked that question in this room before. Cassian was folding the contract. He didn't lift his head, didn't pause, and answered in the voice of a man discussing the weather. The contract doesn't have a clause for that. Outside, the hail continued tapping against the glass. Adeline rose to her feet, and she didn't know that the question she had just asked would remain there, silent and waiting, until exactly 3 years later, when someone would finally answer it. Adeline stepped into the hallway, and the sound of the elevator echoed from the far end, like a long breath drawn by the building itself. She had taken only a few steps when Ezra Kane called her name. He didn't move quickly, and he didn't hurry. He simply approached with the measured gait of a soldier who had learned to walk without being heard, and in his hand was an ivory envelope, so thin that at first glance it seemed to hold nothing at all. Ezra handed it to her, and in that moment, something very strange appeared on the face of a man who never allowed anything to show. It wasn't pity. It wasn't curiosity either. It was the look of someone returning to another person, something that should never have left their hands in the first place. He told her very quietly that it belonged to her, that Cassian had kept it before he even knew her name. Adeline took the envelope, and even before she opened it, she felt the weight of what was inside. A small, familiar weight, the kind her hand had remembered since she was a child standing before a mirror and watching her mother brush her hair. She tore open the edge of the envelope with her fingertip, and the silver hair clip fell into her palm. It had tarnished with age, the plating worn away at one corner, the clasp slightly loose from being opened and closed too many times over too many years. Across the metal ran a diagonal scratch that Adeline herself had made when she was 10, after dropping it on the kitchen floor. It was the hair clip her mother had worn on her wedding day. It was the thing Adeline had been searching for over the past 6 weeks, turning out her hospital locker, digging through every pocket, standing in the changing room, and telling herself that if it was gone, then it was gone, because life had already taken far greater things from her than this. She stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, her hand closing tightly around it, and a chill traveled through her entire body from the back of her neck downward, because there was one simple thing she understood immediately. That hair clip couldn't have made its way on its own from her hands into the possession of the man sitting inside that room. There was only one path by which it could have reached him, and that path passed through a night she had sworn to herself she would never speak of again. She turned around. The door to the room was still slightly open. Inside, Cassian Rinaldi stood with his back to the hallway, looking down at the city through glass marked by streaks of hail. She asked him why he had it. Her voice was quiet, but in the silence of the 41st floor, it sounded like a needle striking the ground. Cassian didn't turn around. He didn't ask what she was talking about. He didn't ask where she had gotten it. He simply said, with complete calm, that he hadn't known who it belonged to, and that he didn't keep other people's belongings. Then he fell silent, and that silence closed between them like a steel door. Adeline remained there for a few more seconds before walking away, and it wasn't until much later that she understood this had been the first time in his life that Cassian Rinaldi had lied to her. That afternoon, she drove to Elm Grove. The last sunlight of the day slanted through the windows of the second-floor room, laying a warm golden glow across the wool blanket. Marianne Whitmore sat in a chair beside the window, her hair silver, her hands resting in her lap, and when her daughter entered, she looked up with the distant, courteous expression of someone receiving a kind visitor she had never met before. She asked Adeline who she was. Adeline said she had come to visit, then pulled a chair closer, took the silver hair clip from her pocket, and fastened it into her hair the way she did every day. She took her mother's hand, thin and light as a dried leaf. And then, as always, that strange thing happened again. Marianne didn't remember her daughter's name. She didn't remember that face. She didn't remember that she had ever had a child. But when that warm hand closed around hers, she began to sing, very softly, slightly off rhythm, the same lullaby she had sung beside a cradle many decades before. Adeline lowered her head, rested her forehead against the back of her mother's hand, and remained there in silence until the sun had disappeared completely. The next morning, while Adeline was still sleeping off her overnight shift, a man named Roy Devlin was summoned to an upstairs office in the freight district south of Lake Michigan. He had been the night shift foreman for 7 years and knew every crane, every warehouse door, every stretch of time when the security cameras turned the other way. He walked into the room with the easy confidence of a man who believed he was only being called in to answer a few routine questions, and he sat down in the chair across the desk with both hands placed neatly on the tabletop. Cassian Rinaldi was already there waiting. He didn't greet him. He didn't look up right away. He was reading a sheet of paper, and he finished every line before folding it slowly, with the same care someone might use to fold a dinner napkin after a meal. Roy began to talk. He talked about production from the previous quarter, about how several containers had been delayed because customs officials were making things difficult, about how he had been forced to stay at the warehouse until morning 3 nights in a row. Cassian let him speak. He didn't interrupt, didn't nod, didn't show whether he was listening or not. When Roy finally ran out of things to say and began repeating himself, the room fell silent. The silence lasted longer than it should have, long enough for the hum of the air conditioner on the wall to become painfully clear, long enough that Roy had to clear his throat. Only then did Cassian reach inside his coat, take out a photograph, and place it on the desk, turning it so it faced the man across from him. It was a photograph of a 2-story house in the western suburbs, with a gray tiled roof, a low white wooden fence, and a child's bicycle leaning against the side. A beautiful new house, the kind a night shift foreman might have to save for 20 years to afford. Roy looked at the photograph. Cassian was wearing leather gloves, and with one finger he pushed the picture a little farther across the table. Then he asked, in a quiet voice, the kind of voice the entire city had learned to fear, what color the front door was painted. That was all. No accusation, no number, no name. Roy Devlin opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked at the photograph, then at Cassian, then back down at the photograph, and in that instant, everything he had done over the past 11 months rose before him with such terrible clarity that he could no longer pretend. The man sitting across from him knew. He had known for a very long time. He knew about the house, the color of the door, the child's bicycle leaning against the side, and that man had sat quietly for 11 months, watching Roy dig his own grave, only to place a single photograph on the table today and ask one harmless question. Roy collapsed back into his chair. His shoulders sagged as though someone had pulled the spine from his body. He began to talk, speaking quickly now, naming people, giving quantities, dates, even confessing things no one had asked him about. Cassian didn't write anything down. He stood before Roy had finished, picked up the photograph, slipped it back into his coat, and walked toward the door. Ezra Kane entered to take his place, pulled out the chair, opened a notebook, and began writing. When the door closed behind Cassian, 2 men were waiting in the hallway outside, and one of them quietly told the other that people didn't fear Cassian Rinaldi because of the things he had done. They feared him because no one knew where he would stop. 3 days later, inside a small civil registry office in the center of the city, Adeline Whitmore became the wife of that man. The ceremony lasted 11 minutes. There were no flowers, no music, no photographer, no cake, no one standing beside her to hold her coat. Ezra signed the witness line, and the registry clerk signed the other, because there was no one else in the room. When the official reached the part, asking whether they were entering the marriage of their own free will, Cassian said yes, and Adeline said yes, and both answered in the flat, even voices of people confirming a line in an official record. There was no kiss. Cassian wore his gloves throughout the entire ceremony. When it was over, he opened the door and let her walk out first, and that was the only gesture he made that day that caused Adeline to look up at him one more time. That afternoon, Adeline walked into the house she would now call home, carrying 2 canvas bags and a cardboard box filled with books. The person who came to meet her was Odette Fontaine, the housekeeper who had worked for the family longer than Cassian had been alive. She didn't ask whether Adeline needed help. She simply took the heavier of the 2 bags, naturally, as though the gesture had already been decided long before Adeline arrived. Then she led her through the house, speaking as they walked, not in the tone of someone giving instructions, but in the voice of someone passing along the things another person needed to know in order to survive. She told Adeline that breakfast was served before the sky had fully brightened, and anyone who didn't come down simply missed it because no one waited for anyone else. She told her that if she heard cars arriving in the courtyard at night, she shouldn't go to the window to look. She told her that certain men came and went from this house whose names she shouldn't ask, and if they greeted her, she should simply nod and say nothing more. She told her that the telephone in the living room was shared, and if Adeline needed to call someone without anyone else knowing, it would be best to make the call from the hospital. Adeline listened and committed every rule to memory, because 7 years working in intensive care had taught her that in places where one small mistake could cost something enormous, people didn't ask why. They learned the rules first. At the end of the hallway, Odette stopped. She turned toward Adeline, and this time her voice changed. She said there was only one thing she wanted her to remember carefully. The staircase behind the kitchen led down to the basement, and Adeline was never to go down there. Adeline asked why. Odette looked at her for a long moment, then said only that, in this house, the best questions were the ones never spoken aloud. She set the bag down outside Adeline's bedroom door and walked away. That evening, Adeline was summoned upstairs. Rosalind Rinaldi, Cassian's grandmother, sat in a high-backed chair with one hand resting on the top of a wooden cane, and she looked Adeline over from head to toe the way someone might inspect an item that had just been delivered. Carefully, without hurry, and without pretending not to stare. She asked Adeline her age. She asked what she did for a living and how long she had done it. She asked whether her parents were still alive, and when Adeline answered that her father was dead and her mother was in the hospital, something very brief passed across the old woman's face, so brief that Adeline thought she might have imagined it. Then Rosalind struck the end of her cane against the floor once, and said she would speak plainly so neither of them wasted time. She said she didn't need Adeline to love her grandson. She said affection was a luxury this family couldn't afford, and that many people in this house had died because they had made the mistake of loving someone. She said the only thing she needed from Adeline was to stand properly beside him whenever someone took photographs, smile just enough, and never let anyone see the two of them standing too far apart. Adeline asked what would happen if one day she did more than that. Rosalind was silent for a moment, then told her to go to bed because the night was cold. On her way back to her room, Adeline passed the kitchen and saw that the light was still on. Cassian was sitting there alone, with a plate of cold bread and a cup of black coffee in front of him that had long since stopped steaming. The kitchen was larger than the apartment Adeline had lived in for 7 years, gleaming, spotless. And there, in the middle of it, the wealthiest man she had ever met was eating the supper of a night watchman. He didn't look up. Adeline stood in the doorway for a few seconds and was about to continue on when one detail caught her eye and held it there. He was still wearing his leather gloves. Inside his own home, in the middle of the night, when no one was watching, even while holding a piece of bread, he still didn't take them off. She returned to her room carrying that question with her through the entire night, along with 2 others that no one in this house was willing to answer. That night, lying in an unfamiliar room with 3 questions no one had answered, Adeline closed her eyes, and the memory returned on its own, the memory she had spent the past 6 weeks trying to bury, and had failed to bury even once. 6 weeks earlier, St. Brendan Hospital had held a fundraising gala for its new treatment wing. Adeline hadn't attended the party. She had been working the night shift upstairs, and she knew something had happened only when the thunder of running footsteps rose from the ground floor hallway. A man had collapsed in the middle of the lobby. She ran downstairs with the emergency bag in her hand, and the first thing she saw wasn't the patient, but 3 men in suits surrounding him, one of them physically stopping the physician on duty from reaching him. Someone shouted for an ambulance. One of the 3 men said, with perfect calm, that there would be no ambulance. Adeline didn't understand what was happening. She only dropped to her knees, checked the man's pulse, and found it weak, his skin cold, his pupils slow to react. She said he needed to be taken to the emergency room immediately. The other man bent down, looked directly into her eyes, and told her she was coming with them. She felt something hard and cold press lightly against her back through the fabric of her blouse, and she understood that it wasn't an invitation. They put her into the car with the unconscious man. The doors closed, and outside, the city streamed past the windows in long ribbons of light. The car stopped in front of a house in Lake Forest, far from the main road, surrounded by dark trees. They laid him on a long dining table. Someone pulled a table lamp closer, and for the next several hours, beneath that dull yellow circle of light, Adeline Whitmore did the work she had been doing for 7 years of her life. She had no monitor, no breathing tube, no physician on duty to consult. She had the equipment inside her emergency bag, 2 bottles of intravenous fluid taken from the medicine cabinet in the house, and her own 2 hands. She started an intravenous line. She loosened his collar. She turned his head to one side. She checked his pulse, counted his breaths, wrote everything down, then 15 minutes later, checked again, counted again, wrote again. There was no medical chart, no monitoring sheet, so she did what any nurse would do by instinct. She reached for a printed sheet lying on the table, turned it over, and wrote on the back with the ballpoint pen from her pocket, 1 line at a time: pulse, blood pressure, respiratory rate, blood type. After she personally drew a small vial and labeled it according to procedure, because at that moment there was only one thought in her mind, that if this man died, there had to be at least 1 piece of paper stating exactly what she had done and when she had done it. Sometime in the middle of the night, he stopped breathing. She performed chest compressions, counting aloud, while the men surrounding the table stood in absolute silence and watched a woman who weighed less than 110 pounds throw the entire weight of her body down onto their boss's chest. He began breathing again. His pulse returned. Adeline dropped to the floor with her back against the leg of the table, both hands trembling from exhaustion. Outside, dawn still hadn't come. Her mouth was dry and bitter, her throat raw from counting aloud for so long. On the table sat a glass pitcher and a drinking glass. She poured herself some water and drank it all, and the world tilted. Morning light woke her. It poured through a gap in the curtains in a harsh white strip, cutting across the wooden floor, and Adeline opened her eyes inside a room she had never entered before. She lay still for several seconds. Then she understood. She understood everything immediately, without anyone needing to explain it, because the human body was a language she had spent 7 years reading, and it never lied. She sat up very slowly. The man lay on the bed beside her, still unconscious, his breathing steady again. Adeline looked at him, and the first thought that passed through her mind wasn't anger. It wasn't pain either. It was a cold calculation. She was a nurse carrying $340,000 in debt, with a mother in a nursing home, no relatives, no lawyer, no one standing behind her. The man lying there was Cassian Rinaldi. If she opened her mouth, no one would believe her, and she would be the one who paid the price. She got to her feet. She folded the sheet covered in her hurried handwriting into quarters and slipped it into the pocket of her blouse. She took the labeled blood vial from the night before, the one she hadn't had the chance to send anywhere, and placed it in the other pocket. By reflex, she lifted a hand to her hair to adjust the silver clip, but it was gone, and she no longer had time to search for it. Then she opened the door, went down the stairs, and walked out of that house before the man inside could open his eyes. A month passed in that house, and Adeline gradually realized that there was a language being spoken to her every day that no one was willing to acknowledge. She kept her regular shifts at St. Brendan, because that was the only thing in her life that still belonged entirely to her. And whenever she came home before dawn, the light in the kitchen was always on. It wasn't left burning all night. She had paid close attention to that. It came on only around the time she was due home. On the stove sat a small covered pot, and inside was a portion of food reheated until it was just warm enough. Never too cold, never too hot, as though someone had calculated precisely how many minutes it would take her to walk from the parking lot to the front door. She asked Odette about it. Odette only said that she was following instructions, and she didn't say who had given them. Then one day, Adeline's nursing shoes disappeared from the shoe cabinet by the door. They were the pair she had worn for 3 years, the soles worn down unevenly on one side, the leather across the toes cracked into thin white lines, and she still hadn't bought new ones, because the month before she had put every dollar she had into her mother's nursing home bill. In the place where the old shoes had been sat, an unopened cardboard box. Inside was a brand new pair of nursing shoes, the exact brand she always wore, the exact size, the exact color, with not a single note included. She picked up the box, then set it back down and stood there for a long time, because she didn't know whether she should feel cared for or afraid that someone knew even the size of her shoes. The following week, an envelope arrived from Elm Grove. She opened it with that familiar tightening in her stomach, the feeling that had followed her for 4 years whenever she saw that seal. But the paper inside wasn't a bill. It was a confirmation notice stamped to show that every expense had been paid in full for the entire year, with an additional note stating that Marianne Whitmore's room had been moved to a section with a window overlooking the lake. Adeline sat down on the stairs with the paper in her hand, and for the first time in many months, she didn't have to calculate where she was going to find $9,000 for the following month. That evening, when she returned to her room, she found a dark brown leather-bound notebook and a pen on the bedside table. The notebook was thick, with fine paper and a stitched spine. Beside it lay a folded note in slanted, rigid handwriting containing only one sentence, saying that since she wrote everything down, she should use something better. There was no name beneath it. Adeline looked at the old ballpoint pen in the pocket of her medical blouse, the pen that had followed her through more shifts than she could count, and she understood that whoever had written that note had seen her taking notes somewhere, at some moment, without her ever knowing it. From that night on, she began writing in the notebook. It wasn't a diary. She wrote the way a nurse wrote a medical chart, brief, dry, dated, without adjectives. Then, one night, near the end of the month, after 3 shifts in a row, she fell asleep while reading in the library, her head resting against the arm of the chair. The notebook slipped from her lap onto the carpet and fell open to the page she had just written. Cassian passed by and stopped. He bent down and picked it up. He hadn't intended to read it, but the page was already open before his eyes, and there were only 3 lines written there. The first line was the date. The second said that today, Mother still didn't remember my name. The third said that it was all right, because it was enough that I remembered. Cassian stood there for a very long time with the notebook in his hand. Beyond the window, wind from the lake stirred the curtain gently. Then he closed the notebook and placed it on the small table beside her, exactly where she would see it when she woke. He took the wool blanket draped across the back of the chair and laid it over her shoulders carefully, making sure his hands didn't touch her. He remained there a little longer. Then he turned off the light and left, closing the door as quietly as he could. And from beginning to end, he didn't say a single word. Less than 2 weeks after that night, Adeline was awakened by pounding on her door. It wasn't knocking. It was pounding, rapid and without restraint, the kind of sound she had learned to recognize during the years she spent working night shifts in the emergency department. She sat bolt upright in the darkness. Odette was standing outside the door, her face drained white, a cleaning cloth still clutched in one hand, and she said only one thing, that they needed Adeline downstairs immediately. Adeline grabbed the emergency bag she always kept beneath her bed out of habit from 7 years in medicine, then ran after her down the hallway. But Odette didn't lead her toward the front door. She took her around the kitchen to the back staircase she herself had warned Adeline never to use, and she stopped at the top step without going any farther. Adeline looked at her for 1 second, then started down. The basement was cold, the air thick with dampness and the smell of metal. In the middle of the room stood an old pool table, and someone had pulled off its white cover and spread it across the surface. Lying there was a man Adeline had never seen before, around 30 years old, his face pale, his jaw clenched so tightly he could barely keep from crying out. 3 other men stood around the table. One of them held a flashlight. The ceiling light overhead was nothing more than a dim round bulb, too weak to see clearly by, so the only real light in the room came from the flashlight trembling in the hand of a man who was trembling too. Adeline asked why they hadn't taken him to a hospital. No one answered. Then a voice came from the darkness behind them, quiet and calm, saying that he couldn't go to a hospital, and that she had 3 minutes to decide what she was going to do. Cassian stood there with his back against the brick wall, both hands still covered in gloves. Adeline set her emergency bag on the edge of the pool table. Someone handed her a tin box, and when she opened it, she found a veterinarian suturing kit inside. Curved needles, dissolvable thread, hemostats, everything clean, but nothing meant for a human being. She stared at it for a few seconds. Then she asked for clean water and towels, and told the man with the flashlight to move to the left, hold it a little higher, and keep his hands steady. She scrubbed her hands to the elbows with the bottle of alcohol from her own bag. Her hands were shaking, and she knew perfectly well that they were shaking, but the moment her fingers touched the wound, they stopped. Because over the past 7 years, her body had learned how to separate fear from work. After that, there was nothing left in the basement but sound. The sound of metal touching the side of the tin box. The sound of her naming each instrument before reaching for it, clear and brief, as though she were surrounded by a real surgical team instead of 4 men holding their breath. The sound of the man on the table breathing sharply through clenched teeth. The sound of her telling him to count backward from 20. The sound of him reaching 14 before his voice broke. The sound of sutures pulling through flesh. And in the middle of it all, when the pain reached its highest point, the man on the pool table cried out a name. He didn't call for Cassian. He didn't call for one of his men. He called for his mother. Twice, his voice breaking like a little boy's, and then he passed out. Adeline didn't stop. She finished the work, tied the final knot, checked his pulse, covered the wound with gauze, then instructed the man beside her how to watch him over the next 6 hours, and which warning signs meant they had no choice but to wake her. When it was over, she straightened her back. It ached from bending over for so long. She pulled off her gloves, dropped them into the aluminum basin, then looked toward the brick wall, where the man in the shadows was still standing motionless. Then she spoke in a calm voice, without anger and without accusation, the voice of someone reporting a laboratory result. She said that he had just called for his mother. She said that in 7 years working in intensive care, she had stood beside many people during the final minutes of their lives, and almost every one of them had called for their mother. She said she had never once heard anyone call for their boss. Not a single person. Not ever. Then she picked up her emergency bag and walked back up the stairs without waiting for an answer. Cassian didn't say a word. He remained in that same spot for a long time after the sound of her footsteps had completely disappeared upstairs. That night, the light in his study stayed on until dawn, and the only person who knew was Ezra Kane, who passed the doorway 3 times and each time saw Cassian sitting perfectly still, reading nothing, writing nothing, simply staring into the empty space in front of him. The first signs had appeared about 10 days earlier, and Adeline had ignored every one of them. First came the smell of coffee. One morning, when Odette poured coffee into a cup in the kitchen, the scent Adeline had lived with through 7 years of night shifts suddenly hit her so hard that she had to step backward toward the doorway. She blamed the lack of sleep. Then came the smell of disinfectant soap at the hospital, that sharp, biting scent she had breathed in so often that she had long ago stopped noticing it, suddenly clinging to the back of her throat every time she pushed open the changing room door. She blamed 3 consecutive shifts. She was a nurse. She knew exactly what she needed to know. And because she knew so well, she refused even more fiercely to let herself consider it. Because it was impossible. Until that evening in the grand dining room, when everything collapsed in front of 22 of the most powerful people in Chicago. She rushed down the hallway, one hand covering her mouth, the other gripping the wall to keep herself from falling. The guest restroom was at the end of the corridor. She pushed the door open, locked it, and doubled over. The nausea came in waves, violent and merciless, until there was nothing left inside her to bring up, and still it wouldn't let her go. She gripped the edge of the sink with both hands, forced herself upright, and looked into the mirror. The face staring back at her was deathly pale, her hair disheveled, and the silver hair clip had slipped crookedly to one side. She turned on the faucet, scooped up cold water, and splashed it over her face. Then she stood perfectly still, both hands still braced against the sink, and in that silence she began to count. She counted backward. She counted a second time to make sure. She counted a third time, and by the third, her knees had gone weak. Outside in the hallway came the sound of footsteps, then someone's voice asking through the door whether she was all right, and she heard herself answer that she was fine, her voice normal, almost cheerful, the professional voice she always used to reassure patients' families outside the intensive care unit. That night, she didn't return to her room. She got into her car, drove straight to St. Brendan, and called Camille Sorensen from the parking lot. Camille arrived 20 minutes later, her hair tied up in haste, a coat pulled over her pajamas, and she didn't ask a single question. She swiped her badge to unlock the laboratory, switched on one row of lights, then pointed toward a chair in the corner and told Adeline to sit down. Outside, the hospital corridor after midnight was lit only by the pale green glow of the emergency exit signs. Camille did everything herself, asked no one for help, entered nothing into the system. Then she placed the test strip on the steel table between them, and they both stared at it. Time moved so slowly that Adeline could hear the air conditioning running inside the walls. The first line appeared. Then, the second began to darken, slowly, steadily, without hesitation, until it was so clear that there was no denying it. Camille said nothing for a long time. Then she pulled her chair closer, sat down in front of her friend, took Adeline's ice-cold hands in hers, and asked only one word. Who? Adeline opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She thought of that night in Lake Forest, of the dull yellow circle cast by the table lamp, of the morning light cutting across the wooden floor, of the sheet folded into quarters, and the labeled blood vial she still kept inside her locker downstairs in this very building. She thought of the 6 doctors who had signed a document stating that the man couldn't father a child. She thought about how, if she told the truth, there wouldn't be a single person in the world who would believe her. And then she understood something that sent a chill down her spine. She was carrying inside her something that, by every piece of medical evidence, shouldn't have been able to exist. She slid from the chair and sank onto the cold tile floor, her back against the leg of the laboratory table, unable to answer her friend's question. Camille sat down beside her and didn't ask again. She simply wrapped an arm around Adeline's shoulders. Out in the dark hallway, a few dozen steps from the laboratory door, a man stood hidden behind a concrete pillar. He had been there since before Camille arrived. He took out his phone, and beneath the pale green light spilling down from the exit sign, the black stone set into the ring on his finger flashed once, then went dark. He dialed a number. The phone rang exactly twice before someone answered on the other end. He spoke only 4 words, very softly. It has already begun. Adeline didn't wait until the next morning, and she didn't consider hiding it for even a second. She drove home while the sky was still dark, walked straight through the foyer, went up to the hallway on the upper floor, and pushed open the door to her husband's study. Cassian was sitting there. He was still wearing the same clothes from the dinner the night before, his tie loosened, and there was nothing on the desk in front of him. No papers, no glass of liquor, no telephone. How long he had been sitting there like that, only he knew. Adeline stood in the middle of the room, with both arms hanging at her sides, and she said it plainly, without hesitation, without beginning with anything else. She told him she was pregnant. Cassian didn't move. He didn't ask her to repeat herself. He didn't look surprised. And that was what sent a chill through Adeline, because she understood that he had already suspected it from the moment the silver tray struck the marble floor. He pulled open the drawer on his right, took out a thick file, and placed it on the desk between them. He didn't open it. He only said that inside were the conclusions of 6 doctors from 4 different hospitals, written over the course of many years, and every one of them said the same thing. He said he had lived with those papers longer than he had ever lived without knowing what they said. Then he looked up at her and told her she had 30 seconds to give him the name of the other man. In the corner of the room stood an old grandfather clock, and suddenly its ticking sounded so loud that it hurt. Adeline didn't need 30 seconds. She answered immediately. She said there was no other man. She told him about that night at the house in Lake Forest, about how his men had taken her from the hospital lobby, about the long table in the dining room and the table lamp that had been pulled closer, about how she had performed chest compressions when he stopped breathing and counted aloud while his men stood around them. She said that when it was all over, she had been thirsty, and she had drunk from the pitcher on the table. She said she remembered nothing after that, and that when she woke, morning had already come. She told him that he didn't remember that night, but she did, and she had lived with it for 6 weeks before he put that marriage contract in front of her. Cassian listened to everything. He didn't interrupt her once, and when she finished, he looked at her for a very long time, longer than all the times he had ever looked at her before put together. And there was something on his face that Adeline couldn't read. Then he spoke, his voice still quiet, saying that immediately after that night he had ordered everything reviewed. He said he had demanded the records, the reports, the entry and exit logs from that house, because losing 6 hours of his memory was something that had never happened to him before, and he wasn't the kind of man who ignored things that had never happened before. He opened the drawer a second time and placed a photocopied sheet on the desk. It was a copy of the Lake Forest house entry log, and on the line recording the time she had left, there was her signature, written clearly, alongside a note stating that the nurse had been driven home before midnight. He said he had held that page in his hands for 6 weeks. He said that if she had left the house before midnight, then everything she had just told him couldn't have happened. Adeline looked down at the paper. The signature looked so much like hers that even she had to look at it twice. But she knew with absolute certainty that she had never signed any logbook in that house, because when she left, there had been only one thought in her mind: getting through the door before anyone woke up. She looked up. She didn't cry. She didn't step toward him. She didn't ask him to believe her, didn't swear to him, didn't say a single word shaped like a plea. She only said that for 7 years, her job had been to walk into hallways and tell patients' families the truth. She said she had once been forced to tell a mother that her child hadn't survived while that mother was still holding the new coat she had bought for him. She said that after standing in that place so many times, she had completely lost the ability to lie in order to save herself, and that this was the one thing she still possessed, the very thing she had told him from the beginning that he couldn't buy. Then she fell silent. Cassian stood up. He walked to the window, turned his back to her, and remained there for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't any louder than before. He said there would be a paternity test as soon as the pregnancy was far enough along. He said that until then, she wasn't to leave the grounds unless Ezra went with her. He said nothing else. That night, his belongings were moved into the room at the far end of the east hallway, and inside that house, the cold returned exactly as it had been during the first days after she arrived. The 6 weeks that followed were the longest 6 weeks of Adeline's life. She kept working, kept going to Elm Grove on Sunday afternoons, kept sitting alone at one end of the long dinner table while the seat at the other end remained empty. The blood sample was taken on a gray morning by the family's private physician himself, an older man who arrived at the house carrying a brown leather case, worked quickly, and said very little. Adeline held out her arm and watched the vial slowly fill, and she wasn't afraid, because this was the one thing in the entire nightmare she knew with absolute certainty. The results came back on a Thursday afternoon, the very day the family had gathered. There were 22 people in the grand dining room that day, the heads of the different branches, the family attorney, and Rosalind seated at the head of the table with her wooden cane standing beside her chair. Adeline was called downstairs. The moment she entered, she knew something was wrong, because no one looked at her. Every person in the room was staring down at their plate. Cassian stood at the far end of the room holding an opened envelope. He said nothing when she approached. He simply pulled out the sheet inside and threw it onto the table, and the paper slid across the polished wood until it stopped directly in front of her. Adeline lowered her eyes. She read the conclusion, printed in bold across the middle of the page. No biological relationship. She read it a second time, then a third. The words remained exactly where they were, black against white, refusing to blur, refusing to change. She looked up and opened her mouth to speak, but Cassian spoke first, and his voice was something Adeline had never heard before. Low, even, and so cold that the room seemed to lose several degrees of warmth. He said that from this moment forward, the woman standing there had no connection to the Rinaldi family. He said that whatever money had already been spent was gone, and no one was to demand a cent of it back, and no one was to touch her. He said that anyone who mentioned her name again inside this house would have to speak with him privately. Then he turned to Ezra and told him to bring the car to the door. He didn't look at Adeline once during any of it. Halfway down the table, a hand wearing a ring set with a black stone lifted a glass of wine, turned it slightly, then set it back down. Rosalind remained perfectly still, both hands folded over the head of her cane, and she didn't say a word. Adeline went upstairs and packed her belongings into the same 2 canvas bags she had arrived with. Exactly 2, no more. She left the new nursing shoes in their box. She took the leather-bound notebook, because the words inside belonged to her. Ezra drove her away. Rain began falling as the car passed through the gates. Adeline sat in the back seat with one hand resting over her stomach by instinct, watching through the window and waiting for the car to turn onto the main road. But it didn't turn onto the main road. It continued for another 20 minutes through several quiet neighborhoods, then stopped in front of a low-rise apartment building lined with trees. Ezra got out, opened the door for her, and handed her a key. The apartment was on the 3rd floor. Everything was already there. The lights were on. The heat was running. The refrigerator was full of food, arranged neatly, including the same ginger tea Odette had made for her every morning. On the dining table lay a stack of documents, and Adeline opened them. The first page was the lease for the apartment, paid in full for 1 year. The second was the transfer paperwork moving her mother to a better nursing facility north of the city, all expenses already paid, and in the box listing the relative responsible for guaranteeing payment was a name she had never heard before. She understood immediately what it meant. Someone had tried to erase every trace of her mother from any record carrying the Rinaldi name. Adeline stood in the middle of that warm apartment for a very long time. She looked at the full refrigerator. She looked at the papers. She thought about the way a man had just thrown a sheet of paper in front of 22 people, and then quietly paid an entire year's rent for her. And she understood that this was the only way he knew how to say something he didn't dare put into words. But she understood something else too. If she sat down in that chair, ate the food in that refrigerator, slept in that bed, then she would become forever what that paper had declared her to be, a woman who had been taken care of, an expense neatly handled and closed. She placed the keys on the table beside the documents. She picked up her 2 canvas bags, walked down 3 flights of stairs, and stepped out into the rain. That night, using the money still left from her night shift wages in her own bank account, Adeline Whitmore rented a room on the 2nd floor of an old building on Halsted Street, where the stairs creaked and the window looked out onto a brick wall. She set her 2 bags on the floor, sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in all those weeks, she allowed herself to cry. St. Brendan wouldn't take her back. No one said it outright. They only said the schedule was full, that they would contact her again, that she should rest in her current condition. And by the 2nd sentence, Adeline understood that someone had called ahead of her. She didn't argue. She applied for work at a small private clinic on Ashland Street, a place that treated patients without insurance and paid by the shift, and they hired her that same afternoon because no one wanted to work nights in that neighborhood. From then on, her life narrowed into a very small circle. She walked from Halsted Street to the clinic as darkness fell, worked through the night, treating cuts, fevers, and drunken men asleep in the waiting room chairs, then walked home before dawn. Wind off the lake pushed up through the streets, cold and damp, slipping beneath the collar of her coat. And she moved much more slowly now because her stomach had begun to show clearly beneath her clothes. Some days she had to stop halfway, lean one shoulder against a streetlight, breathe for a while, and only then continue walking. The silver hair clip remained in her hair every single day. Then one morning, just after she opened the door to her room and took off her shoes, the landlord brought her an envelope that had arrived the day before. It was a letter from the nursing facility on the north side. Adeline opened it and read, and with every line her hands grew colder. The letter informed her that payments for Marianne Whitmore had been stopped at the request of the guarantor, that the facility would hold her place for another 30 days, and that after that period, if no one assumed responsibility for the cost, she would be transferred to a public facility under assistance coverage. Adeline read it again to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed, the paper still in her hand, and something inside her broke very quietly. For all those weeks, she had told herself that the man had only been doing what he was forced to do, that paying a full year of rent and moving her mother somewhere better meant there was still one place inside him that hadn't turned completely to stone. She had held on to that thought more tightly than she wanted to admit. Now this letter was in her hand, and it said something painfully clear, that he had withdrawn from that too, that the woman lying in that nursing bed was nothing more than another expense crossed off a list. She didn't cry. She folded the letter, put it in the drawer, washed her face, and slept for 3 hours before her next shift. What Adeline didn't know, and wouldn't know for a very long time, was that for 3 nights in a row that week, down on Halsted Street, about half a block from the entrance to her building, a black car sat motionless at the curb, with every light turned off. It arrived after she left for work, and drove away before she returned. Inside the car, Cassian Rinaldi sat in the back seat, reading nothing, calling no one, simply staring up at the dark second-floor window. On the 3rd night, Ezra Kane turned off the engine and sat in silence for a long while before finally speaking. He said that the light in her room had been on for some time, which meant she had come home earlier than usual. He said there were only 2 flights of stairs in that building. He said that if Cassian wanted to, it would take him less than a minute to get from where they were to her door. Then Ezra turned fully around and asked him directly why he didn't go up. Cassian didn't answer at once. He kept looking at that window for a while longer, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough, like that of a man who hadn't spoken in a very long time. He said that if he knocked, she would open the door, and she would look at him, and she would ask him exactly one question. He said she would ask whether he believed her yet. Then he fell silent for a long time before finishing the thought, saying that he still didn't have an answer to that question, and that he wouldn't climb those stairs and stand in front of that woman with empty hands. Ezra started the engine. The car pulled away from Halsted Street, and the second-floor window remained lit a little longer before finally going dark. 30 days. That was the number lodged in Adeline's mind through all the nights that followed, and it wouldn't let her sleep. She calculated every possibility, asked to borrow money wherever she could, called 3 different facilities to ask about assistance programs, and each time she hung up the phone, she could see more clearly the abyss opening beneath her mother's feet. Then one night, after her shift, while sitting in her rented room and emptying everything from the 2 canvas bags in search of an old identification document, her hand touched something at the very bottom of one bag. It was the envelope containing the things she had taken from St. Brendan when she cleared out her locker. Inside was the sheet of paper folded into quarters, yellowed along the creases, and a small specimen tube with a handwritten label that had begun to fade. Adeline unfolded the paper. She hadn't looked at it once since that night in Lake Forest, because looking at it meant looking directly at something she wanted to forget. But now, beneath the yellow light of her rented room, she read each line of her own hurried handwriting. Pulse, respiratory rate, blood pressure rechecked 15 minutes later, a note about starting the intravenous line. And near the bottom of the page, slanting slightly because her hand had been trembling at the time, was a short line recording the blood type of the man who had been lying on that long table that night, along with the time the sample had been drawn, exactly according to the procedure she had followed thousands of times in her life. Adeline stared at that line. Then something lit up inside her mind, cold and sudden, the way an unexpected diagnosis could reveal itself in the middle of a night shift. She rushed to the drawer, pulled out the documents she had brought with her from that house, and among them was a copy of the paternity test result that Camille had helped her obtain for her own records. She spread it across the table beside the old sheet of notes. In the section listing the information for the comparison sample, the official report stated the blood type of the man whose sample had supposedly been collected. Adeline looked at the 2 lines side by side. They didn't match. She sat down very slowly. She read them a second time, then a third, then took out a pen and wrote both blood types on a blank sheet of paper to make certain her eyes weren't deceiving her. They still didn't match, and inside her mind, everything began rearranging itself. A major laboratory didn't make mistakes like this, because they used machines, procedures, controls. If the result itself had been falsified, all anyone had to do was repeat the test somewhere else, and the fraud would be exposed immediately. But if the error wasn't in the result, if it was in the sample, then everything changed. If the blood tube sent to the laboratory carried Cassian Rinaldi's name while containing someone else's blood, then the laboratory could do its work with complete honesty, produce a perfectly accurate result, and that accurate result would become the perfect lie. They could repeat the test 10 times, 100 times, and every test would return the same answer. no one would suspect anything. No one, except the one person in the world who had personally determined his blood type on a night no one was ever supposed to remember, and had written it on the back of a printed sheet with the old ballpoint pen from the pocket of her medical blouse. Adeline stood in the middle of her rented room with the paper still in her hand, and she laughed, a short, dry laugh, the sound of someone who had just realized that for all these months she had been pushed out of her own life by a piece of paper she herself had the means to prove was wrong. The next morning, she called Ezra Kane from the public telephone at the end of the street. She said nothing over the phone. She only arranged a meeting. Ezra arrived an hour later and sat down at a plastic table inside the small diner across from the clinic, and Adeline pushed the 2 sheets of paper toward him. She didn't give him a long explanation. She pointed to the first line, then the second, and told him that the blood in the tube sent for testing hadn't belonged to her husband. Ezra bent over the papers and stared at them for a long time. He was a former military medic. He understood immediately what it meant, and Adeline saw the exact moment his face changed. He asked whether she had shown anyone else. She said no. He asked again, more slowly this time, whether it was truly possible that no one else knew. And when she nodded, he leaned back in his chair and remained silent for a long while. Then Ezra told her something he had been carrying inside himself for weeks, without understanding why it kept bothering him. He said the private physician who had come to the house to collect the sample that morning was no longer in Chicago. He said the man had resigned 3 days after the result came back, then left the city, and no one had been able to reach him since. Adeline looked directly into his eyes and asked whether he believed her. Ezra picked up the 2 sheets, folded them carefully, slipped them into the inside pocket of his coat, and stood. He said he didn't need to believe her, because there were things in this world that remained true whether anyone believed them or not, and that now he was going to do what should have been done months ago. Ezra Kane didn't go looking for the doctor who had disappeared. He went to the house in Lake Forest. The house had been empty for months, the doors shut, the curtains drawn, and the layer of dust on the long dining table was thick enough to hold the clear print of his hand when he brushed across it. Ezra had ordered the house surveillance system checked immediately after that night, and the report sent back to him stated that all footage from that evening had been lost because of a transmission failure. He had believed that report, and for months afterward, the fact that he had believed it was the one thing that kept bothering him every time he thought back. Because Ezra had served in the military, and in the military they taught you that every system had to have a backup, and anyone who installed that system would place the backup somewhere a person in a hurry wouldn't think to look. He went down to the ground floor, opened the machine room door behind the laundry area, and there, beneath a dust-covered metal casing, a small recording drive sat silently, with its power light blinking at a steady rhythm. He took it with him. That night, in the study on the 3rd floor of the mansion, Ezra placed a computer on the desk in front of Cassian and told him there was something he needed to see. The recording lasted less than a minute. It began from the upper right corner of the dining room, black and white, grainy, without sound. In the center of the frame was the long table, and on it lay a motionless man. 4 figures stood around him. Then, at the 11th second, all of them stepped back at once, and a small woman in a medical blouse climbed fully onto the table, dropped to her knees beside the man, placed one hand over the other on his chest, and drove the entire weight of her body downward. She pressed, then pressed again, steady, relentless, without stopping. Her head snapped back as she shouted something toward the men surrounding her, and one of the 4 figures ran out of the frame. She bent down, turned the man's head to one side, checked him, then placed her hands back on his chest and continued. At the 31st second, her shoulders could be seen beginning to shake from exhaustion, but the rhythm of her hands didn't slow at all. At the 38th second, the man's chest lifted very slightly. The woman stopped, pressed 2 fingers to his neck, and held them there. And at the 40th second, she tipped her face toward the ceiling, her shoulders dropping, her whole body collapsing forward. Then the screen went black. Cassian said nothing. He started the recording again from the beginning. He watched it all the way through a second time, still silent, both hands resting on the desk. He played it a 3rd time. This time, he didn't look at the man lying on the table. He looked at the woman. He watched the way she climbed onto that table without hesitating for even half a second, while 4 larger men stepped back around her. He watched those hands. The same hands that months later would stitch one of his men back together in a basement beneath the beam of a flashlight. He watched that 40th second, when she lifted her face and collapsed, because she had emptied everything she had just to keep him breathing. And he thought about a Thursday afternoon in the grand dining room, when he had thrown a sheet of paper across the table in front of 22 people and declared that the woman standing there had nothing to do with this family anymore. Cassian stood up. He took 2 steps, then had to brace one hand against the wall, remaining there with his head lowered, and Ezra Kane turned his face away because in all the years he had served this man, he had never once seen Cassian need to hold on to anything. When Cassian finally raised his head, his voice was nothing more than a hoarse rasp. He told Ezra to get the car. The black car stopped on Halsted Street when it was already late. The second-floor window was still dark, which meant she hadn't come home yet. Cassian sat inside the car and waited. And this time Ezra didn't ask him a single question. Nearly an hour later, a small figure appeared at the end of the street, walking slowly, one hand supporting her stomach, the silver hair clip catching the light beneath a street lamp. Cassian opened the car door and stepped out. Adeline saw him when she was still about 10 steps away, and she didn't stop, nor did she walk any faster. She came to a halt in front of him and said only that if he had come to give her more papers, she wouldn't take them. Cassian didn't answer. He followed her up 2 flights of creaking wooden stairs, and when she opened the door to her room, he stopped at the threshold and didn't step inside. The room was only about 15 square meters. 1 single bed, 1 table pushed against the wall, a small electric burner sitting on top of a compact refrigerator. The window looked directly onto the brick wall of the building next door. Her freshly washed medical blouse was draped over the back of a chair, and on the table lay the leather-bound notebook, open beside a ballpoint pen. Cassian looked around the room once, and Adeline saw his jaw tighten. He was still standing at the threshold. His hands dropped to his sides, then lifted again, and finally he seemed to have no idea where to put them, so he let them hang loosely beside his body. And it was the first time in Adeline's life that she had ever seen that man not know what to do with his own body. He began to speak, and his voice was awkward, broken by pauses. Nothing like the quiet voice the entire city had learned to fear. He said he had watched the footage from that night. He said he knew what she had done. Then he stopped for a long time before continuing. He said that night she hadn't been given a choice. He said he hadn't been given one either, but he said that what happened had happened more to her than to him, that he had lost only 6 hours of memory while she had lost everything else, and that it had taken him far too long to understand something so simple. He said that afterward, he had held a piece of paper in his hands and believed it instead of believing her. He said that he had stood in the dining room of his own house and spoken words he would never be able to take back. Then he fell silent for a long while, and when he spoke again, the sentence came slowly, 1 word at a time, as though he were learning how to pronounce a foreign language. He said he hadn't come there to ask her forgiveness. He said he had no right to ask for that. He had only come to ask what she needed, anything at all, and he would do it. Adeline stood in the middle of the room, with one hand resting on the back of the chair. She looked at him for a very long time. Outside, wind from the lake slipped through the gap in the window and made a thin whistling sound. Then she spoke, her voice calm, never rising at all. She said he had paid a full year's rent for an apartment for her. She said he had moved her mother somewhere with a window overlooking the lake. She said he had bought her shoes, bought her a notebook, kept the kitchen light burning while he waited for her to come home every night for an entire month without saying a single word to her. She said she had counted every one of those things, one by one, and she knew exactly what they were worth. Then she said the thing she needed wasn't among them. She said what she needed was for him to believe her. Not because some piece of paper proved something, not because some recording showed him something, but because he had lived beside her long enough to know what kind of person she was. She said that from the very first day, she had told him there was one thing he couldn't buy, and even now, that thing still couldn't be bought. Cassian didn't argue. He lowered his head and stood that way for a long time at the threshold. Then he asked her only one question, whether she would allow him to prove it. Adeline didn't return to that house. She made it clear that very night that she would remain on Halsted Street, that she would keep working the night shift, and that if he wanted to take her for another test, she would agree on one condition. The following morning, at an independent laboratory on the west side of the city, Adeline herself was the one wearing the medical blouse. She disinfected the site with her own hands, drew her husband's blood with her own hands, labeled the specimen herself, completed the documentation herself, and signed her name in the box, identifying the person who had performed the collection. She didn't allow anyone to touch that tube. She carried it all the way to the intake counter, stood there and watched as they entered the identification code, and didn't leave until she was holding a stamped receipt in her hand. Cassian sat in the waiting chair outside the hallway the entire time, both gloved hands resting on his knees, and he didn't ask a single question. The results came back 4 days later. Adeline went to collect them herself, opened the envelope herself right there at the intake counter, and read the report while standing in the middle of the laboratory hallway beneath the white fluorescent lights. There was only one line that mattered: probability of biological paternity. 99.99%. She read it again. Then she looked up at the man standing a few steps away and handed him the paper without saying a word. Cassian took it. He read it very quickly, then read it again very slowly, and Adeline watched his entire face collapse in silence. He didn't rejoice. He didn't embrace her. He only stood there with the paper in his hand, and the first thing he said wasn't an exclamation, but a question as cold as steel, asking that if this was true, then what had he been living with all these years? 3 days later, Ezra Kane found the person they needed. Not the doctor who had fled the city, but a much older name, the first name listed in the thick file Cassian had kept inside his drawer for so many years. Dr. Warren Halloran, the physician who had signed the first conclusion when Cassian was still lying in a hospital bed. His body shattered after the night his older brother died. Halloran no longer practiced medicine. He lived alone in a small ground-floor apartment in Evanston, with a window overlooking the parking lot. When the door opened, the man standing inside was nearly 70, stooped with age, and both of his hands trembled constantly, the uncontrollable shaking of an illness that had followed him for years. He looked at Cassian, then at the pregnant woman standing beside him, and he didn't ask who they were. He only stepped back and opened the door wider, as though he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. In the small living room crowded with books and carrying the smell of medicine, Cassian sat down in the chair across from him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten him. He didn't mention a single name or a single number. He simply placed the old file on the table between them and asked one question: who had paid him? Warren Halloran looked at the file. Then he began to cry. He cried the way an old man cries after holding back tears for far too long, without sound, only his shoulders shaking while tears ran down both hollow cheeks. He stood up, went into the room beyond, and took a long time to return because his hands were trembling so badly that he couldn't open the lock on the drawer. When he came back, he was carrying an envelope yellowed around the edges, the kind made from thick paper that people no longer used. He placed it on the table and pushed it toward Cassian. Inside was the original medical report, bearing the hospital seal, the signature, and a date that had faded with time. Cassian opened it and read. The conclusion contained only a few lines, and the final line stated that the recorded injuries were moderate. The prognosis for recovery was favorable, and there was no indication whatsoever that the patient had lost the ability to reproduce. Cassian Rinaldi had never been infertile. He sat in silence for a very long time with the paper in his hand. The old man began to speak, his voice breaking into fragments. He said that the other man had come to see him during the second week after the surgery, when the 22-year-old young man still hadn't fully regained consciousness. He said the man hadn't threatened him at all. He had spoken very softly, almost tenderly, and that was what made it frightening. Halloran repeated the man's words exactly, saying that if the boy believed he could never have children, then he would never marry anyone. And if he never married anyone, there would never be a child who would grow up only to be shot one day, simply because that child carried the Rinaldi name. He said the man had called it mercy. He said that at the time, Halloran had just lost his private practice and was drowning in debt, and he had sat with those words all night until he convinced himself that perhaps it really was better for the young man that way. He said he had signed. Then he looked up at Cassian and said one final thing, that he hadn't kept the original document because of conscience, but because of cowardice, because he had been afraid that one day someone would come back looking for him, and he would need something to save himself. Adeline had remained silent from the beginning, one hand resting over her stomach. Only now did she step forward. She wasn't angry. She didn't raise her voice, and when she spoke, her voice was the voice of someone who had spent 7 years standing in intensive care hallways delivering news to families who were waiting. She said that people entered a hospital carrying the most precious thing they possessed, their own bodies, and they placed those bodies into the hands of people wearing the coat he had once worn. She said they didn't understand the terminology, couldn't read the numbers, had no way to verify what they were being told, so the only thing they could do was trust. She said he had taken that trust and sold it, and the price had been 12 years of a man's life. 12 years spent believing that he was the final period at the end of his own bloodline. She said illness hadn't stolen those 12 years. A signature had. Warren Halloran sat with his head lowered, both hands trembling violently on his lap, and he couldn't say another word. When they reached the door, Cassian stopped. He didn't turn around. He only said that Halloran would have to repeat everything he had just said somewhere else, in front of other people, and that this time he wouldn't be allowed to be a coward. News of the trip to Evanston spread through the house before the car even reached the gates. The following afternoon, Odette Fontaine called the clinic, and she said only that the old lady wanted to see Adeline alone, without Cassian, and that she had been waiting in the upstairs room since morning. Adeline arrived just as the sky was beginning to turn toward rain. Rosalind Rinaldi sat in her high-backed chair as straight as ever, but this time the wooden cane wasn't standing beside her chair. It lay across her lap, and on the small table in front of her sat a dark wooden box, the kind once used for cigars, its lid polished smooth by years of hands passing over it. She didn't invite Adeline to sit. She simply pushed the box forward and told her to open it. Inside were papers. A great many papers, stacked, tied with string, yellowed with age. Adeline lifted the top layer, and she immediately recognized what she was holding, because she had seen an identical document in the Evanston apartment the day before. Rosalind said she had kept it inside that box for 12 years. She said she had known it was the genuine report from the moment someone secretly placed it in her hands. Adeline's head snapped up. She asked why Rosalind hadn't given it to her grandson. The old woman looked directly into her eyes and said only one sentence, that she had thought keeping it from him was saving him. Then she began to tell the story. She said she had buried 2 sons and 1 grandson over the course of 20 years, that she had stood beside 3 graves and counted every name still left in the family, that when Tobias died, Cassian was the only grandson she had left, and she had sworn to herself there would be no more graves. She said that if Cassian believed he couldn't have children, he would never marry anyone, and if he never married anyone, there would be no one for their enemies to target. She said she had known it was a crime, and she had committed that crime every day for 12 years, every time she watched her grandson sit alone in the kitchen eating his dinner. Adeline stood perfectly still. She thought of the man who wore leather gloves, even while holding a piece of bread, and she understood that his loneliness had been stitched onto him by the very hands of this old woman. But Rosalind wasn't finished. She told Adeline to turn to the papers underneath. There was another set of documents there, thinner than the first, and on the first page was a diagram of a shipping route, along with a list of crates. Rosalind said that many years earlier, she had discovered that Cassian's uncle was using the family's transport routes to move something Cassian had absolutely forbidden. She said she couldn't expose him within the family, because half the people in the house were on his payroll, so she had done what she believed was the smartest thing. She found an outsider, a long-haul truck driver who belonged to no one, a decent man with a conscience, and she let him know what was inside the cargo on that particular run. She said she had only intended for him to report it to the police and then walk away. She said she had accounted for everything except one thing. Then she fell silent for a very long time before finishing, saying that the truck lost its brakes on an overpass during a rainy night, and the driver hadn't been able to get out of the cab in time. Adeline didn't hear the rain beginning to strike the windows. She heard her own voice from very far away, asking the driver's name. Rosalind said it aloud. It was her father's name. The papers in Adeline's hands didn't fall, because her fingers had closed around them so tightly that they could no longer open. The old woman continued, her voice dry as paper, saying that afterward, the man had done one more thing. He had created a debt in the dead man's name, $340,000, entered into the records of a credit fund he himself controlled, so that if anyone ever traced the death, the paperwork would point to a bankrupt truck driver instead of a witness. She said the debt that had weighed on his daughter's shoulders for 4 years had been created by the same hand that killed him. She said he was also the one who had ordered the Lake Forest entry log altered and Adeline's signature forged. She said he was also the one who had called the nursing facility and stopped the payments for her mother in the family's name, without Cassian ever knowing. Then Rosalind took an old photograph from her pocket and placed it on the table. In the picture, a man around 60 was raising a glass at a party, and on one finger he wore a ring set with a black stone. She said his name was Ambrose Rinaldi, her husband's younger brother, Cassian's grand-uncle by blood. Adeline placed the papers down on the table. She didn't ask another question. She walked out of the room, down the stairs, across the foyer, and straight into the courtyard. Rain was pouring down, bitterly cold, the kind of late autumn Chicago rain that stung the skin. She stood in the middle of the courtyard with both arms hanging at her sides and tilted her face toward the sky. She remained that way for a very long time, and then she realized something that frightened even her. She couldn't cry, not a single tear. Inside her there was nothing left but an empty space, flat and freezing. Exactly like the emptiness she had seen in the eyes of patients' families after she had delivered the news and they had already run out of tears. The call came in the middle of her night shift the following evening. They told her that Marianne Whitmore hadn't been able to eat since the day before, that her breathing had begun to change, and that if Adeline could come, she should come soon. Adeline took off her medical blouse in the middle of the shift without asking anyone's permission. She only told the person working beside her that she had to leave. Cassian arrived outside the clinic 15 minutes later. He didn't ask anything. He simply opened the car door. By the time they reached the facility, dawn still hadn't come. The room on the second floor was small and warm, with a window overlooking the lake, and beyond it the water was still dark. Marianne lay on her side with her eyes closed, her breathing shallow and slow. Adeline pulled a chair close to the bed, sat down, and took her mother's hand. She stayed like that for 2 days. People brought her food, but she didn't touch it. They told her to go home and sleep for a few hours, and she shook her head. Camille Sorensen came once to visit, stood in the doorway looking in, then quietly walked away. Cassian never left the hallway outside. He didn't enter the room. He sat on the plastic chair opposite the door, both gloved hands resting on his knees, and every time Adeline looked up through the glass panel in the door, he was still there. Throughout those 2 days, Marianne never opened her eyes. Sometimes she shifted slightly. Sometimes her fingers curled inside her daughter's hand, but she didn't wake. Adeline talked to her mother. She told her small, ordinary things. Stories about her shifts, about the weather, about a bakery on Halsted Street that opened early in the morning. She talked without needing an answer, because she had been accustomed to doing that for many years. On the third morning, when the first sunlight poured through the window and laid a pale golden strip across the blanket, Marianne Whitmore opened her eyes. Adeline knew immediately, even before her mother turned her head, because that gaze was different. It wasn't distant. It wasn't courteous. It looked straight at her, and it was there, truly there. In her profession, Adeline had heard about moments like this. She had stood in hallways and listened as sons, daughters, husbands told her in trembling voices that their mother, their wife, had awakened once, only once, after years of no longer recognizing anyone. She had nodded and told them that it was something precious. She had never imagined she would be given such a moment herself. Marianne looked at her daughter for a long time. Then she lifted one hand very slowly and reached toward Adeline's hair. Her thin fingers touched the silver hair clip, traced along its back, then stopped exactly where the diagonal scratch was. She smiled. Then she called her daughter's name. She called her Addie. She said that Addie was making her tired. She told her to go to sleep. Adeline couldn't answer. She bent down, pressed her cheek against her mother's hand, and her whole body began to tremble. Marianne let her remain that way for a while. Then she continued, her voice hoarse and quiet but every word clear, saying that her father had kept a notebook. She said he wrote down every trip in it, what day it was, what he carried, where he went. She said that on the last night before he left, he had given it to her and told her to hide it carefully, not to give it to anyone, not even their daughter. She said she had hidden it beneath the bottom of the second drawer of the sewing table, under the fabric lining, and that the sewing table was now in storage with the belongings from their old apartment on Kedzie Street. When she finished, she let out a long breath, as though she had finally set down something she had been carrying for far too long. Adeline lifted her head. She was about to ask something, but Marianne had begun to sing, very softly, slightly off rhythm, the same lullaby she had sung beside a cradle many decades before, the lullaby she had sung so many times in recent years without knowing who she was singing it for. This time she knew. She sang while looking at her daughter, and she sang the entire song without missing a single word. Adeline collapsed against the edge of the bed. She cried. For the first time since that afternoon, she had stood in the rain outside the mansion, and she cried like a child, unable to hold anything back, her shoulders shaking beneath her mother's hand, which was still resting on her head. Out in the hallway, Cassian rose from his chair and walked toward the door. He heard the singing. He stopped at the threshold, looked inside only once, then turned his face toward the wall beside him and remained there. The man whose name made an entire city lower its voice stood with his face toward a cream-colored wall in the hallway of a nursing facility, and he didn't allow anyone to see his face. Marianne finished the song and fell silent. She said nothing else. She closed her eyes and slept. That afternoon, when the sun sank low and the lake beyond the window turned the color of copper, her breathing grew farther apart. Adeline knew. She sat with her back straight, both hands wrapped tightly around her mother's hand, and she didn't call anyone into the room. She told her mother to go to sleep. She told her that she was there. She told her that she wasn't going anywhere. The breaths grew farther apart. Then they stopped. The room was very quiet. The last light of the day rested motionless across the blanket. Adeline remained there, her hand still holding her mother's, for a very long time afterward. 3 days after the funeral, Adeline went to the storage area of the old building on Kedzie Street. The manager led her down to the basement, unlocked Unit 17, and inside were the remnants of a family that had long since fallen apart. A box of dishes, a rolled carpet, and in the far corner, beneath a blue tarp, stood her mother's sewing table. Adeline pulled open the second drawer. Inside there was nothing but thread, needles, and several rolls of elastic that had begun to rot with age. She took everything out, then slipped her fingers beneath the edge of the fabric lining at the bottom of the drawer and peeled it back. The notebook was there. A worn blue, hardbound notebook of the kind long-haul drivers still bought at roadside stops. And across the cover, her father had written the name of the route by hand. She sat down on the cold concrete floor and opened it. Inside was his handwriting, large and slightly slanted, recording every trip over many years. Date, point of departure, destination, cargo numbers, name of the person who signed for delivery. And on the final pages, the handwriting changed. It became smaller, more hurried, and no longer followed the usual format. He wrote that there were 3 crates not listed on the shipping order. He wrote that he had opened one of them and looked inside. He recorded the identification numbers, recorded the name of the person who delivered them, and on the second to last page, he wrote one short line saying that if anything happened to him, this was the reason. The final page contained only one sentence, written to his wife, telling her to hide the notebook carefully and not give it to their daughter because he didn't want the girl to have to carry this. Adeline sat in that basement for a very long time with the notebook on her lap. She took it home, and that evening she gave it to Ezra Kane. Ezra read it from beginning to end without saying a word, then called someone he knew at the federal prosecutor's office. While they waited, he took out a file he had been compiling himself over the past several weeks and placed it on the table so she could see exactly where everything stood. Adeline turned through the pages one by one. Then she stopped. In the middle of the file was a copy of an old report dated nearly 3 months earlier, from before that hail-struck afternoon on the 41st floor. It was a background review prepared by Cassian's people, and it listed everything about a night shift nurse named Adeline Whitmore: place of employment, financial situation, her mother's name and nursing facility, and on the 4th line, her father's name, accompanied by a note about the overpass accident and the $340,000 debt. She read that line 3 times. Then she picked up the entire file and went straight to the mansion. Cassian was in his study. She placed the documents on his desk, opened them to that exact page, and asked him when he had learned whose daughter she was. He looked down at the paper. He didn't deny it. He said he had known before they signed the contract. Adeline asked another question, her voice very calm, asking whether he had searched for her after the night in Lake Forest. Cassian was silent for a while, then said yes. He said that when he woke, he had still been holding a silver hair clip in his hand, and he remembered nothing except that he was alive. He said he had ordered people to check every hospital in the city for 6 weeks to find out who it belonged to. He said that when they found her, the file about her reached him at the same time, and inside that file was the name connected to the man who had died on the overpass. Adeline nodded very slowly. Then she asked the last question, the one she had been afraid to ask ever since leaving the basement on Kedzie Street. She asked whether the 3-year contract, the apartment paid in full for a year, the shoes, the notebook, the kitchen light left burning every morning while he waited for her to come home, whether all of those things had been for her, or whether they had been for a debt he believed he owed to a dead man on an overpass, because that man had died because of the system Cassian himself controlled. She said she didn't need him to make it sound good. She only needed him to tell the truth. Cassian stood up. He walked to the window and remained there for a very long time. Then he turned back toward her, and what he said wasn't an answer. He said he didn't know. He said he had asked himself that question many times, and had never dared to be certain, because those 2 things had been tangled together from the very first day, and he hadn't been honest enough with himself to separate them. Adeline looked at him, nodded, then picked up her father's notebook and walked out. That night, somewhere else in the city, a man received word that Dr. Warren Halloran had been taken to the federal prosecutor's office that afternoon, with an attorney beside him. He sat motionless in the darkness for a very long time. Then the black stone ring on his finger tapped twice against the tabletop, and he began making calls. Everything began to collapse before dawn. 3 transfer points south of the lake were frozen at the same time, licenses suspended, accounts locked, and by mid-morning half the people who still answered to Cassian had stopped answering their phones. Ezra Kane read the list to him over the phone, and when he reached the 9th name, he stopped, because both men understood what it meant. Ambrose wasn't attacking the money. He was cutting off every route so he could free his hands for something else. Cassian called Adeline. The phone rang, and no one answered. That afternoon, Adeline went to the nursing facility on the north side to sign the remaining papers and collect her mother's belongings. She descended into the underground parking garage after dark, carrying a canvas bag with a few sets of clothes and a framed photograph inside. Only half the lights in the basement level were working that night. She heard the footsteps before she saw the man. They weren't the footsteps of someone walking toward his own car. They were the footsteps of someone matching the rhythm of hers. She didn't turn around. She had worked in hospitals for 7 years, and she knew one thing very well that men like Gil Trask never thought about. Every large building was designed to save lives, and all she needed was to know what was where. She turned left instead of continuing toward her car. She walked another 10 steps to the concrete pillar with a red glass box mounted on it, smashed the glass with her elbow, and pulled the alarm lever all the way down. The bells screamed through all 4 levels at once. The emergency lights flooded the entire garage in white. The elevator doors opened automatically in evacuation mode, and in less than 2 minutes, the entire building poured down into the parking garage. Employees, nurses, patients, families, security guards, everyone at once, surrounded by alarms and blinding white light. Gil Trask stopped in the middle of that moving crowd. He couldn't do anything. Adeline moved against the flow toward the emergency stairs, exited through the rear door, reached her car, and drove away. She didn't drive back to Halsted Street. She drove to St. Brendan, because in the entire city there was only one place where she knew every door, and it was the place she had walked through for 7 years in the darkness of night shifts. She called Ezra from the car, said exactly 3 sentences, then hung up. Rain began falling as she arrived. She didn't enter the patient wing. She went around the back toward the utility building, a 4-story structure that housed the generators and ventilation systems, where no one was present at night except a single maintenance operator. She swiped her badge at the door, and she knew perfectly well that her access had been revoked the day she left. But she also knew that the ground floor utility door had never locked properly, because the hinge had been broken since 2 winters earlier. She climbed the western fire stairs. They followed her as far as the 3rd floor before Ezra arrived. Then Cassian came. What happened afterward survived in Adeline's memory only in scattered fragments. She remembered the rain hammering against the metal roof of the utility building, thick and relentless, drowning out almost every other sound. She remembered the steel door to the rooftop bursting open and the wind striking her face. She remembered the red warning light atop the antenna mast, sweeping across the wet concrete in steady intervals. She remembered Ezra shouting for her to get down behind the air conditioning unit. She remembered 2 dry cracks echoing from the wall on the other side, then several more, overlapping with the sound of the rain. She remembered Ezra Kane stepping in front of her, his entire body blocking the space between her and the figure at the far end of the rooftop, and she remembered the moment his body jerked before he slowly dropped onto one knee. She remembered crawling to him immediately, her hands searching, finding the place, pressing down, and she remembered her own voice counting, loud and steady, in the middle of the rain. She remembered Cassian crossing the rooftop. She remembered 2 figures struggling beside the edge of the railing, in the rain, neither of them saying a word. Then she remembered another shot, closer than all the others, and after that shot came a long silence filled with nothing but rain. Down on the street, the red and blue lights of police vehicles began sweeping across the walls, turning in circles, casting bands of color that moved back and forth over the wet rooftop. A siren wailed below. A loudspeaker echoed from the street. Adeline looked up. Cassian was standing there in the middle of the rooftop, rain pouring over him, his hair plastered against his forehead, and he was still holding something in one hand. At his feet, about 2 steps away, a man lay on his back on the wet concrete, one hand pressed against his shoulder, the black stone ring on his finger catching the rotating lights. Cassian looked down at him. The man was his grandfather's younger brother. He was the man who had taught Cassian how to tie a necktie when Cassian was 11 years old. He was the man who had stood beside him at Tobias's funeral. He was the man who had stolen 12 years of his life with someone else's signature. Cassian stood motionless for a very long time, and across the entire rooftop, there was nothing left but the rain. Then he opened his hand. The thing he had been holding fell onto the wet concrete with a hard, dry sound, slid a short distance, and came to a stop. The man lying on the wet concrete began to struggle for breath. Cassian didn't move. He stood there in the rain with both hands empty and looked down at him. No one on that rooftop could have blamed him if he had remained exactly where he was for another 3 minutes. 3 minutes would have been enough. He knew it. Ezra knew it. And the man on the ground knew it too. because he looked up at his nephew, and there was no pleading in his eyes, only the waiting of a man who had already calculated how his story would end. But then came the sound of running footsteps. Adeline crossed the rooftop, her hair soaked through, one hand supporting her stomach, and dropped to her knees beside Ambrose Rinaldi. She didn't look at his face. She tore off her coat, folded it into quarters, and pressed it down where pressure was needed with both hands, putting the full weight of her body into it exactly the way she had done hundreds of times in her life. She turned toward the stairwell and shouted, her voice breaking apart in the rain, calling for a stretcher, calling for oxygen, calling the emergency department by name, clearly giving the location as the rooftop of the utility building, then repeating it a second time to make sure the people below had heard her. Then she turned back, pressed harder, and began speaking to the man beneath her hands. She told him he wasn't allowed to die. She told him to listen carefully, that he wasn't permitted to die here, tonight, on this rooftop. She said that if he died, everything would close neatly around him. There would be a proper funeral. Someone would stand up and say a few decent words about him, and her father would remain forever nothing more than a bankrupt truck driver whose brakes failed on an overpass. She said dying like that would be far too easy. She said he had to live. He had to sit in a room where someone was taking down every word, and he had to say with his own mouth how her father had died and why. She said she would keep him alive until that happened, even if she had to kneel on this concrete all night. Ambrose Rinaldi looked at her. He couldn't speak, but he could hear her, and he understood, and the only thing he was able to do was close his eyes. Cassian watched all of it. He watched the woman he had once thrown a piece of paper at in front of 22 people, the woman whose mother had died only 3 days earlier, the woman carrying his child inside her, kneeling in the rain to keep breathing the man who had taken her father from her. And he understood something very simple that no one had taught him in 34 years of life. There was a kind of strength that required nothing at all in your hands. When the emergency team reached the rooftop, Adeline handed over the patient in 3 short, precise sentences, giving them everything they needed to know, then released her hands, and immediately turned toward Ezra Kane. He was sitting with his back against the air conditioning unit, his face deathly pale, his lips turning blue from the cold. She dragged the emergency bag closer, called out each item she needed by name, and began working beneath the beam of a flashlight held for her by one of the rescue workers. Ezra watched her, and between 2 breaths, he let out a dry laugh and said that at least this time they had equipment made for humans. Adeline didn't laugh. She told him to be quiet and count backward from 20. Ezra reached 9 before the stretcher team arrived. The rain was still falling. Down on the street, red and blue lights swept across the walls in circles, and the crackle of radios mixed with the sound of water rushing through the gutters. Adeline stood up, both knees numb, both hands shaking violently from the cold. Cassian stepped toward her. He removed his coat and laid it around her shoulders, and this time he didn't ask what she needed. Adeline looked down at the stretcher being carried through the steel door, watching the man with the black stone ring being taken away so he could remain alive and so he could answer for what he had done. Then she spoke, her voice hoarse, barely audible beneath the rain. She said that for years the entire city had told itself that people feared Cassian Rinaldi, not because of what he had done, but because no one knew where he would stop. She looked up at him. She said that tonight, she finally knew. She said he stopped at exactly the place where a person could still turn back. Cassian didn't answer. He only stood there in the rain looking at that woman, and in that moment he knew with absolute certainty that if she gave him one more chance, he would spend the rest of his life becoming the man she had just described. The trial opened in the spring of the following year, and it didn't last nearly as long as people expected. The prosecution needed only 3 things. The first was the worn blue notebook of a long-haul truck driver, with its final pages recording the identification numbers of 3 crates that hadn't appeared on the shipping order, and 1 hurried line, saying that if anything happened to him, this was the reason. The second was the testimony of Dr. Warren Halloran, who sat in the witness chair with both hands trembling violently and told the entire truth he had hidden for 12 years. And when he was asked why he had waited until now to speak, he answered only that he had been a coward long enough. The third was the collection of documents inside the wooden box that Rosalind Rinaldi personally brought to the courthouse. And the old woman walked into the courtroom on her own with her wooden cane, refusing anyone's arm. Ambrose Rinaldi sat through all of it. He had survived, exactly as the woman kneeling over him on that rain-soaked rooftop had forced him to survive. And with his own mouth he told the court what had happened on that overpass that night. The sentence was handed down on a March afternoon, but the person who left the entire courtroom silent was someone else. Months before the trial, Cassian Rinaldi had voluntarily gone to the federal prosecutor's office with his attorney and turned over the complete operational records of the family, holding nothing back. He didn't ask for immunity. He accepted probation, accepted the loss of all executive authority, accepted having his assets placed under supervision, accepted reporting every month like anyone else. Some people said he had gone insane. Some said he was burning down with his own hands what 3 generations of his family had built. He explained himself to no one. Rinaldi Meridian was restructured into a legal, transparent, independently audited medical equipment distribution company, and 40% of its shares were transferred into a fund bearing the name Marianne Whitmore, dedicated to providing nursing education scholarships for the children of dock workers, the children whose parents had spent their lives working in the district the family had once controlled. The person who signed the documents establishing the fund was Adeline. Baby Annie was born on an April morning, with sunlight outside the delivery room windows and fresh leaves just beginning to open on the maple trees lining the hospital entrance. She had her mother's chestnut brown hair and her father's gray eyes. The second person to hold her, after Adeline, was Ezra Kane, his shoulder still bandaged, and he received the child from the nurse with the arms of a man who had once been a military medic. Careful, steady, exactly the right way. He stood beside the window, holding her for a very long time without saying anything. That afternoon, after everyone else had gone home, Cassian helped his wife up to the rooftop of St. Brendan Hospital, the place where, for 7 years, she had eaten dinner alone between night shifts. He handed her an envelope. Inside was their 3-year marriage contract, and beside it was a lighter. He said that on the first day she had asked him a question, and he had answered that the contract didn't contain a clause for it. He said that now he had an answer. He said that if either one of them changed their mind, that person was free to leave, without debt, without conditions, without anyone holding them back. He said that from this day forward she was free, and that he had arranged everything so that wherever she went, neither she nor their child would ever lack anything. Adeline held the contract in her hands. She asked him what would happen if she stayed. Cassian stood silent for a moment. Then he raised one hand, removed the leather glove from his right hand, then removed the one from his left, folded them together, and slipped them into his coat pocket. It was the first time in all those months that Adeline had seen her husband's bare hands. He reached toward her slowly and placed one hand over her stomach. He said that if she stayed, it would be the first time in her life that she stayed because she herself wanted to, not because someone had paid for it, and that he would spend the rest of his life becoming worthy of that choice. Adeline looked at him for a very long time. Then she answered the question she herself had asked him in his study that night, the question he hadn't dared to answer. She said she had thought about it for months. She said that perhaps in the beginning he had come to her because of a debt. And perhaps that was true, but she said people didn't leave the kitchen light burning for an entire month because of a debt. People didn't stand with their faces turned toward a wall in the hallway of a nursing facility because of a debt. People didn't open their hands and let go of what they were holding onto wet concrete because of a debt. She said that what something began as mattered less than what it had become. Then she lit the lighter. The small flame caught the edge of the paper and traveled along the clauses, and Adeline held the burning contract over the railing before opening her hand. The ashes lifted into the air and dissolved into the afternoon light above the rooftops of Chicago. At that exact moment, the wind carried the soft warmth of spring across the rooftops of Chicago. Cassian reached out, his bare fingers gently intertwining with Adeline's, and for the first time in 12 years, the man whose name had once made an entire city lower its voice felt a deep, quiet peace. The story of Adeline and Cassian leaves us with something very simple. No one in this world has the right to decide for another person how much their life is worth, or what they are allowed to hope for. One person stole 12 years from her grandson because she believed she was protecting him. Another stole 4 years from a young woman by building a false debt upon the death of her father. And what finally brought those two people back to each other wasn't fate. It was the day both of them were given back the right to choose their own lives. Believe the people who tell the truth. Be kind even when no one is watching. And remember that trust is the most precious thing one human being can give another. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories every day. How do you feel about Adeline and Cassian? And what do you think you would choose if you were in their place? Please write your thoughts in the comments, because we sincerely want to hear what comes from the deepest part of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we hope to see you again in the next video.